The fog that rolled off the Thames in the late 19th century did more than just obscure the Victorian skyline. It provided a veil for a new kind of theatricality that was about to redefine the upper echelons of London society. In 1889, the opening of the Savoy Hotel marked a definitive rupture in the history of hospitality, transitioning from the dusty, restrictive inns of the past to a palace of electric light and unprecedented scandal. To understand the Savoy is to understand its creator, Richard D'Oyly Carte, a man whose sensibilities were forged in the dramatic fires of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas. Carte realized that the wealthy did not merely want a place to sleep, they craved a stage upon which to perform their status, a sanctuary where the rigorous moral codes of the Victorian era could be quietly suspended behind gilded doors. Built on the site of the ancient Savoy Palace, this new monument to excess was the first in London to be powered entirely by electricity and to offer ascending galleries, the elevators, that whisked the elite upward into a realm of private luxury previously unimaginable. However, the true alchemy of the Savoy lay not in its bricks and wires, but in the partnership Carte brokered with two men who would become the architects of modern aspiration, César Ritz, the meticulous master of service, and Auguste Escoffier, the emperor of chefs. Before their arrival, it was considered social suicide for an English lady of high standing to dine in public. The Savoy changed this forever by creating an environment so opulent, so surgically clean, and so intensely fashionable that the aristocracy abandoned their private manners to be seen in the hotel's glittering dining rooms. This shift created a new, dangerous proximity between the old nobility, the nouveau riche, and the demi-monde. In the shadows of the palm courts and over the crystal rims of Escoffier's legendary Pêche Melba, secrets became the hotel's most valuable, albeit unspoken, currency. The staff, trained to be invisible yet omnipresent, became the silent witnesses to the indiscretions of princes, the bankruptcies of lords, and the illicit trysts that fueled the gossip mills of the Edwardian age. The atmosphere of the early Savoy was one of controlled chaos masked by absolute elegance. Ritz understood that luxury was a form of psychological warfare. He meticulously curated the lighting to flatter the complexions of aging socialites and arranged the tables to facilitate both observation and eavesdropping. Behind the scenes, the cost of this perfection was immense. Escoffier revolutionized the kitchen into a military-style brigade system, but beneath the surface of his culinary triumphs lay a darker reality of kickbacks and financial irregularities. The hidden cost of the Savoy was already beginning to accrue, not just in the massive debts D'Oyly Carte incurred to build it, but in the moral compromises required to keep its powerful clientele satisfied. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the Savoy stood as a beacon of the Gilded Age, a place where a reputation could be minted in an evening or destroyed by a whisper in the ear of a headwaiter, setting the stage for a century of high-stakes deception. The seamless facade of the Savoy began to crack in 1897, revealing that even a palace of light was not immune to the greed and shadow play of its directors. Behind the scenes, the Ritz-Escoffier era ended in a scandal that the hotel management desperately tried to bury within the thick ledgers of its accounting rooms. A private investigation launched by Richard D'Oyly Carte's board discovered that the legendary Auguste Escoffier had been taking kickbacks from suppliers, while César Ritz had been using the hotel's resources to fuel his own burgeoning empire. The dismissal of these two titans was an earthquake in the world of high society, yet it proved a fundamental truth about the Savoy. It was an institution that could survive the loss of its architects because it had become a repository for the secrets of the British establishment. The hotel's discretion was its armor, and as the Edwardian era reached its decadent peak, the Savoy became the unofficial headquarters for the Marlborough House set, the inner circle of the Prince of Wales, who would later become King Edward VII. In the lavish suites overlooking the Thames, the rigid social hierarchy of Great Britain was being dismantled and reconstructed. The Savoy was the site where the dollar princesses, wealthy American heiresses like Consuelo Vanderbilt, were paraded before cash-strapped British aristocrats in a cold exchange of new money for old titles. These marriages were often negotiated in the hotel's private parlors, brokered by lawyers and social fixers over vintage champagne. The hotel staff, particularly the valets and chambermaids, became the guardians of the most sensitive information in the empire. They knew which duke was unable to pay his gambling debts at the nearby clubs and which cabinet minister was visiting a mistress in a suite booked under a pseudonym. This information was power, and in a city where social standing was everything, the walls of the Savoy were saturated with the potential for blackmail and the necessity of silence. As the shadow of the Great War loomed, the Savoy transformed into a theater of international intrigue. The Grand Hotel became a hub for diplomats, arms dealers, and spies who recognized that the anonymity of a crowd was the best cover for clandestine meetings. The hotel's famous American bar became the melting pot where intelligence was traded as casually as cocktail recipes. During this period, the cost of the Savoy's luxury was reflected in the frantic energy of a society that sensed its own end. The lavish gondola party, hosted by George Kessler, where the hotel's courtyard was flooded to recreate a Venetian canal, complete with a baby elephant and silk-draped boats, was the ultimate symbol of a world teetering on the edge of the abyss. It was a display of wealth so grotesque and beautiful that it seemed to invite the catastrophe that followed, marking the final, frantic bloom of a society that would soon find its secrets scattered by the winds of war. The end of the First World War did not bring a return to the hushed modesty of the Victorian era. Instead, it unleashed a frantic, jazz-fueled desperation that turned the Savoy into a fortress of the bright young things. By the 1920s, the hotel had become the laboratory for a new social order where the traditional boundaries of class were blurred by the sheer force of celebrity and American influence. This was the era of the Savoy Orpheans and the rise of the superstar performer. George Gershwin sat at the pianos in the ballroom, and the legendary dancer Josephine Baker brought the intoxicating rhythms of Harlem to the banks of the Thames. However, this newfound vibrancy came with a darker undercurrent. The hotel was no longer just a place for the aristocracy to dine, it was a hunting ground for the burgeoning tabloid press. Journalists and professional guests haunted the lobby, their eyes peeled for the slightest crack in the armor of the elite. The hidden cost had evolved from financial kickbacks to the total erosion of privacy, where every whispered conversation in the American bar was a potential headline. In 1923, the Savoy became the setting for one of the most sensational criminal trials of the century, the Green Bicycle Mystery of High Society, involving the shooting of an Egyptian prince, Ali Kamel Fahmy Bey, by his French wife, Marguerite Alibert, in their luxury suite. The case pulled back the velvet curtains of the Savoy to reveal a world of decadent violence, sexual obsession, and the immense power of wealth to manipulate the law. Alibert, a former courtesan who had once been the mistress of the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, used her intimate knowledge of the British establishment to secure an acquittal. The hotel's management worked feverishly with the Home Office to ensure that the prince's name was kept out of the proceedings. This incident cemented the Savoy's reputation as a black box of history, a place where the most sordid realities of the powerful could be contained, managed, and eventually erased, provided the price was right and the stakes for the monarchy were high enough. As the Great Depression tightened its grip on the world outside, the interior of the Savoy remained a defiant vacuum of luxury. It was during this period that the hotel's staff perfected the art of the client file. These were not mere reservations but detailed dossiers on the preferences, weaknesses, and scandals of their most frequent guests. The concierge desk became a hub of intelligence gathering that would have rivaled any government agency. They knew who required a separate entrance for their mistress, who was struggling with morphine addiction, and whose checks were likely to bounce despite their titles. This information was the true collateral of the hotel. By the mid-1930s, as the specter of another war began to haunt Europe, the Savoy became a nest of appeasers and activists. It was here that figures like Winston Churchill dined in the other club, while across the room, pro-German sympathizers and international financiers discussed the fate of nations over silver service dinners, unaware that the very waiters serving them were often reporting back to MI5. When the sirens of the Blitz began to wail over London in 1940, the Savoy Hotel did not shutter its windows. Instead, it descended into the earth, transforming its massive reinforced basement into the most exclusive air raid shelter in the world. Known as the Savoy Haven, this subterranean bunker became a surreal microcosm of the British war effort, where the scent of expensive cigars mingled with the damp smell of concrete. While the rest of London huddled in crowded tube stations, the elite, including cabinet ministers, American generals, and Hollywood stars like Marlene Dietrich, slept on silk-sheeted bunks while silver service waiters dodged falling plaster to serve gin and tonics. The hidden cost during the war years was a moral one. the hotel became a glaring symbol of the vast inequality of sacrifice. Yet, it also became the epicenter of the special relationship. It was in the Savoy suites that Averell Harriman and Edward R. Murrow orchestrated the propaganda and logistics that would eventually bring the United States into the conflict, all while the hotel's switchboard operators handled calls that determined the movement of fleets and armies. The atmosphere of the wartime Savoy was one of high-stakes tension and forced gaiety. The hotel's famous American Bar served as an unofficial interrogation room where intelligence officers from the newly formed OSS, the precursor to the CIA, rubbed shoulders with exiled European royalty and potential double agents. The staff had to navigate a minefield of security protocols. A single loose word from a waiter could compromise an entire operation. This period saw the rise of the Savoy spy rumors, whispers that the hotel's intricate ventilation shafts and service corridors were being used by MI6 to monitor the conversations of visiting foreign dignitaries. The hotel was no longer just a place of luxury. It was a sovereign territory of information. The secrecy that had once protected Victorian adulterers was now repurposed to protect the survival of the free world, but the price was a total loss of innocence for the institution itself. As 1945 arrived and the lights were turned back on across London, the Savoy emerged into a world that had fundamentally changed. The old aristocracy that had built the hotel's reputation was bankrupt, their estates taxed into oblivion to pay for the war. A new type of high society began to fill the lobby, the titans of the burgeoning oil industry, the stars of the silver screen, and the shadowy middlemen of the Cold War. The transition was jarring. The hotel had to adapt to a clientele that valued celebrity over pedigree and speed over tradition. However, the legacy of the client files remained. In the post-war years, the Savoy's management realized that in a world of increasing global surveillance, their greatest asset was still their ability to provide a blind spot for the powerful. Whether it was facilitating the quiet disappearance of a disgraced politician or hosting the clandestine meetings of the world's first billionaire oil sheikhs, the Savoy remained a place where the world's most expensive secrets were the primary commodity, even as the British Empire itself began to crumble outside its doors. The final decades of the 20th century saw the Savoy Hotel grappling with a world that was becoming increasingly transparent, a reality that threatened the very foundations of its discrete business model. The rise of the digital age and the 24-hour news cycle meant that the walls of the Savoy were no longer the impenetrable barriers they once were. In the 1960s and 70s, the hotel became the stage for the rock and roll aristocracy. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan replaced the dukes and earls of the past. These new icons did not seek the quiet anonymity of the Edwardian era. They brought the chaos of the outside world with them, often clashing with the hotel's rigid traditions. Yet, even in this era of excess, the Savoy maintained its role as a silent arbiter of power. Behind the scenes, the hotel's legendary head of security and the long-serving concierges continued to manage the fallout of celebrity scandals, from drug overdoses to the wreckage of high-profile divorces, ensuring that the most damaging details never reached the Fleet Street tabloids. The true, hidden cost of the Savoy's legacy was revealed in the shifting ownership of the hotel itself. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the D'Oyly-Carte family's long stewardship ended, and the hotel became a trophy in a global game of financial chess. It was eventually acquired by Prince Al-Walid bin Talal of Saudi Arabia, marking a symbolic completion of the hotel's journey from a British imperial monument to a globalized asset. The 2007 to 2010 renovation, costing over £220 million, was an attempt to restore the physical opulence of the past, but it also served as a moment of reckoning. As workmen stripped back the wallpaper and moved the heavy mahogany furniture, they uncovered the physical traces of a century of secrets, hidden safes, long-forgotten service passages used by spies and lovers, and the sheer structural complexity required to maintain a facade of effortless luxury. Today, the Savoy stands as more than just a hotel. It is a monument to the endurance of the elite and the price society pays for the preservation of its myths. The secrets that were once bought and sold within its rooms have largely passed into history, yet the institution continues to function as a sanctuary for those who can afford to buy silence. The cost of a night at the Savoy is not merely reflected in the price of a suite, but in the participation in a 400-year-old tradition of exclusion and observation. As guests walk through the revolving doors on the Strand, They enter a space where time is curated and where the shadow of the past, from the electric dreams of Richard Doyley Carte to the wartime whispers of Winston Churchill, still dictates the rhythm of the present. The Savoy remains a testament to the fact that while high society may change its face, its need for a gilded cage, where secrets are the ultimate currency, remains eternal. The story of the Savoy is the story of how power manages its image, proving that the most expensive thing one can own in London is not a diamond or a title, but a room where no one is looking. Quote,